Okay, so inside our Marine blueprint, we have our update player aim function. Now this function contains code that rotates the player depending on our mouse input, and it also contains code that rotates the player depending on the gamepad right thumbstick input. Now we can't just execute all of this code at once because the mouse input will fight against the thumbstick input. So we need a way to ignore the mouse aiming if we are using the gamepad, and we need a way to ignore the gamepad input if we are using the mouse. We really need to understand which input the player is currently using. We'll get to this really soon, but first, let's just clean up the code we already have, as this will make the next step much easier. Remember, we always want our code to be easily readable, so if we come back to it at any time, we can clearly understand what's going on. So let's start with the nodes that are already hooked up to this function. This handles our mouse aiming. Let's select all of these nodes, and let's encapsulate them down into a function by right-clicking on them and coming to collapse the function. We're going to name this update mouse aim. Now with all the functions we're going to write here, we can select them and let's put them into a category. So this is going to go into a category named mouse input. And we can also put any of the other functions that relate to our mouse input into this category as well. So get mouse velocity, we can drop down the category for it and put it into mouse input. And the same for is mouse above dead zone. Now already this is looking a bit clearer, but we can still clean up the blueprint code inside this function. So let's double click on it to enter it. Let's just move this function entry node up a little. Now, the start of this function reads okay. If the mouse is above the dead zone, continue on and execute the next block of code. But all of these nodes can definitely be cleared up here. First, I'm going to break the link on the player controller and move this down. And I'm just going to set this as the target for get control rotation. Now, why have I done this? Well, when we collapse all of these nodes here down into a function, we won't have to have the get player controller as an input pin on the function. So let's right click on these nodes and let's collapse these down to a function named get mouse aim direction. And we want this function to be a pure const function, and we can put it into our mouse inputs category. And we can just move these nodes up and move these back. And remember, we want to use the player controller as the target of our set control rotation function. Okay, great. So this is much easier to understand now. It's a lot easier to read. So we're finished here. We can close this tab to come back to the main update player aim function. So this just executes our update mouse aim. But remember, we also have all of this code down here that handles the thumbstick aiming. This can all be cleared up as well. But I want you to clear this code up. Collapse your thumbstick aiming code into functions, just like how we've done with the mouse. Think carefully about using impure or pure const functions, then make sure that any functions you do create are added into a new category named thumbstick input. So pause here to clean up your thumbstick aiming code. Okay, so inside my update player aim function, I've cleaned up all the code that handles the thumbstick aiming. It's all contained in an impure function, just like the mouse aim. We are using impure functions for these because inside these functions, we are setting the control rotation of the player controller. We are changing the state of it. I've also collapsed all the code where we calculate the thumbstick aim direction down into a pure const function as well. Now all of these functions are in their relevant categories. We can also put variables in categories too. So the thumbstick dead zone can go into a category named thumbstick input, and mouse dead zone can go into the mouse inputs category, and mouse moving strength can also go into the mouse inputs category. Awesome, so now inside our update player aim function, we are just left with the functions that handle the mouse aiming and the thumbstick aiming. Now we need a way to determine if the player is using the mouse or the gamepad and then switch which function to execute accordingly. So to do this, we can come back to our events graph, but we're going to close all the tabs for our functions so we don't get confused here. Now we're going to come over to an empty space in our event graph. We're going to right click to bring up the action menu. We know that we can call input events to get keys and gamepad buttons, but we can also call an event that will execute whenever any key or button is pressed. This event is called anyKey. So let's get the anyKey event. We can see it has output execution pins for when any key is pressed or any key is released. Now it's called anyKey, but it will also execute for mouse buttons or gamepad buttons as well. We also have this key output pin here. Now what can we do with this? Well, we can drag it out and there are input functions we can call to check to see what kind of key was pressed. We can type is keyboard key, which will return a boolean with the result of if the input came from a keyboard. And we can get a similar function for the mouse, it's called is mouse button. And we can also get one for the gamepad, it's just called is gamepad key. Now your final challenge for this lesson is to create a boolean variable that stores if the gamepad is active. You can determine this with the AnyKey event. Then you want to use this boolean inside your update player aim function. Call update thumbstick aim if the gamepad is active. If it's not active, call the update mouse aim function. So pause here to attempt this challenge and then we can wrap up this lesson. Okay, so to determine if the gamepad is active, whenever any key is pressed, we can check to see if it's a gamepad key. We can simply store the return value as a boolean named gamepad active. And we want to set this whenever any key is pressed. So whenever any key is pressed, we store if it's the gamepad. If it's a gamepad button, then we will know that the gamepad is active. Now this allows us to come back up to our update player aim function that we call from our tick event. And inside this function, we can get our gamepad active variable. And we can move these nodes along here. I'm going to break the link here and hold down B to add a branch. We're going to hook up the entry node to the branch, use the gamepad active as the condition. So if the gamepad is active, we will then update the thumbstick aim. And if the gamepad isn't active, then we must be using the mouse. Awesome, so we're now switching the input depending on if we're using a gamepad or not. We can hit compile and save for the final time for this lesson, and we can come back to our level to play the game. So I can use the mouse to turn around, and as soon as I switch to my controller, I can move and aim with the controller as well. Awesome, so we now have mouse input and gamepad input working without any of them fighting. So let's move straight on to the next lesson so we can start looking into how we're going to handle the player's weapon. So once you're ready, I'll see you there. Okay, so currently our Marine has no weapon in his hands. In this lesson, we're going to give him a weapon and we're also going to spawn some effects when the weapon is fired. Inside our project, in the content browser, we can see we have a weapons folder. We have a skeletal mesh here for a rifle. So remember, this is just a mesh. It doesn't have any sort of behavior. Unreal has no concept of it even being a weapon. We're going to be coding all the weapon behavior in blueprints. With the mesh open, we can see its material slots on the asset details panel, and these are material instances. So we can open these and we can pull the tab off here so we can see the mesh at the same time as our material instance window. And we can adjust the parameters for the material to customize how the weapon looks. So an early challenge for you in this lesson, open the material instances for the rifle and adjust the parameters to customize your Marine's weapon. Then once you've done this, head over to your Marine blueprint and add a skeletal mesh component. Assign the rifle as the mesh, then make the component a child of the character mesh. So pause here to set up your Marine's weapon, and then we'll take a look at how we can actually attach the weapon to the Marine's hands. Okay, so I've customized the material of this rifle that we're going to use for the Marine's weapon. I've gone for a white paint scheme. Back in my Marine blueprint, I've added a skeletal mesh component named rifle, and I've assigned the rifle as the mesh. This component is also a child of the character mesh. This is going to allow us to attach the weapon to the character's hands, so the character actually looks like it's holding it. Now to make this happen, we're going to attach the weapon to a socket. Sockets are like an attachment system in Unreal. They are used for attaching things to skeletal meshes. In games, we usually want to attach meshes to characters, like if it's a weapon in a player's hand, or holstered on the player's back, or even things like hats attached to a character's head. The way we do this in Unreal is by making use of sockets. So if we were to open up the skeleton of our Marine, we would see there is a bone called right weapon, but there's a socket added to this bone named weapon point. You can add sockets to any bone of a skeleton by right-clicking on the bone and hitting add socket, but we've already got one here, so we don't need to do that. We're going to attach our rifle weapon mesh to this weapon point socket on our character skeleton. So inside our Marine blueprint, with the weapon mesh selected, on the details panel we have this socket section. we can assign a parent socket for our weapon mesh by hitting this magnifying glass. Now I'm not sure why the selection goes all the way on the left, but in the selection here we can select different bones and sockets we can attach the rifle to. This is why we made the character mesh the parent for our rifle. If we didn't make the character mesh the parent, we wouldn't have any options here. So we can select the weapon point socket for our weapon. This makes the weapon attached to our character's hand, but it looks like it's disappeared. But it hasn't, it's just above the character because it's retaining its relative offset. To fix this, we could just reset the transforms back to 0 by hitting these yellow arrows. Okay, great. So now if we hit compile and save, and if we come back to our level and hit play, we can see that the character is now holding his rifle. But the next step for us now is to make it appear like the character is firing his weapon. And I've got a good challenge for you to get us started here. Create an action mapping named Fire Weapon, and bind the left mouse button and the right trigger of the gamepad to this, because this is what we're going to use for firing the weapon. Then inside your Marine blueprint, create two functions. The first named Start Firing Weapon, and the second named Stop Firing Weapon. Then inside your event graph, call the action event for Fire Weapon, and execute Start Firing Weapon when the action event is pressed, then execute Stop Firing Weapon when it's released. So pause the video here to attempt this challenge and then come back when you're ready. Okay, so I hope you had a go at the challenge. You should now have an action mapping named Fire Weapon that has the left mouse button bound to it and also the right trigger of the gamepad. Now inside your Marine blueprint, when we press the left mouse button or the right trigger of the gamepad, we should be calling a new function you should have created called Start Firing Weapon, and when we release, we should be calling Stop Firing Weapon. Now these functions aren't doing anything at the moment, but we are going to start adding some code to these. But what's actually going to happen when we fire the weapon? Well, we're going to spawn a particle system on the end of the weapon. We're going to spawn a muzzle flash. If we come back to the content browser, we can see we have this effects folder and we have some weapon effects here, and within the muzzle folder we have the assault rifle muzzle flash. If we drag it out, you might see that you have to compile some shaders, but when it's dragged out into the level you should see a looping particle effect like this. This is what we're going to attach onto the end of the weapon. We're going to attach it to a socket. So I'm just going to remove this from the level. I'm going to come back to my Marine blueprint. In fact, I'm going to make sure I have the muzzle flash selected in the content browser, because when I come back to my Marine blueprint and add a new component, we can see when we go to add a particle system, it automatically will assign our assault rifle muzzle flash here. Okay, so it's spawned into our character, but we want it on the end of our weapon. We're not going to just move it onto the end like this. What we're going to do is drag and drop it onto the rifle to make it a child of the rifle. And then with the muzzle flash selected, we can drop down the parent socket and we can assign it to a muzzle flash socket which is on the rifle. Now again, this is kind of moved away from the rifle, but we can just reset the transforms to set it back. Now this looks a bit silly at the moment because it's always playing. However, we can stop the particle from being active by scrolling down on the details panel. We scroll all the way down and we can find activation, and it's got auto activate checked. If we turn this off, we can see that the particle is now disabled. But for a final challenge for this lesson, I want you to activate the particle when we call Start Firing Weapon, and then deactivate the particle when we call Stop Firing Weapon. So pause here and have a little digging around in blueprints for the final challenge for this lesson. Okay, so if you did some exploring inside your start weapon firing function, you should have a reference to your particle system component, so you can activate it by calling the activate function. Then you should be doing the same in your stop firing weapon function, but you should be calling the deactivate function here. This means that if we come back to our level and hit play, when we hold down the left mouse button or the right trigger on the gamepad, our action event will execute the start firing weapon function, which activates our particle. As soon as we release, we call the stop firing weapon function, which deactivates our particle. So it kind of looks like we're firing the weapon now, but we could be reinforcing this with some audio. So in the next lesson, we're going to be setting up some weapon firing sounds. So once you're ready, I'll see you in the next lesson.